Editions Live, our launch project for the Oxford History of the Book projects in 2021. And it's an exciting experiment that we are doing. My name is Henrike Lähnemann. I'm professor of medieval German literature and linguistics, and I'm also the convener of the so-called method option. A way for master students of modern languages to acquire methodological skills to approach literature and text, and that encompasses paleography, history of the book, and digital humanities. And traditionally, we have dealt with the three elements quite separately, but because of the pandemic this year, we have actually tried to combine as much as possible these three aspects. And I'm hugely grateful to a wonderful crop of students who have managed to come up with an astonishing range of projects that could be realized in this combination of material and digital approaches. So this year, in the first term, we were still able to go into the libraries in a kind of what Dan Wakeler has called a lobster quadrille, where one student would approach to see the book and then retreat, and the next student would come up. But in the second term, most of the students weren't in Oxford, and we had to find other ways of engaging and keeping in contact. And this has led to new ways of exploring actually manuscripts and early printed books via visualizer and smartphone, together with the colleagues, the curators in the Bodleian Library, in the Taylorian, and also today first in Merton College Library. And we have now for you a whole wide range of digital editions, ranging from the animals in the Bestiary today to indigenous languages, Tupi and Welsh in week 4, looking at linked data, at Reformation pamphlets, and a liberal sprinkling of paleography across the topics. How we are running it today is that I'm briefly talking about the genesis of this method option. Then Emma Huber, who has been the ingenious mind behind the actual editions, will talk about how she set up this digital editions course. Andrew Dunning will talk about the mechanics behind presenting manuscripts on screen live. And then we'll have the first of our case studies. You see already one page here in before us, Merton's Bestiary, and Sebastian, who has been working on that, will talk about his digital edition. And then Julia Walworth, Merton's librarian, will show live on screen the manuscript 249. So the first point, the history of the method option. Here you see my predecessor, Professor Palmer, on the gallery of the Taylor Institution Library, pulling out a facsimile of the Easter play of Muri, which he used to document the importance of the materiality of manuscripts, to see how a book unfolds literally, and how you can understand it from looking at, even in a facsimile way, at the material object. And so the tasks he used to set were very practical ones, and that's an approach that we have tried to continue. And he himself was already in a long tradition, because the teaching collection of the Taylor Institution Library was basically set up by Professor Max Friedrich Müller, one of the first professors of German and a renowned Sanskrit scholar, whose father, Wilhelm Müller, was one of the Romantic poets. He wrote the lyrics for Die Winterreise, for example, for Schubert. And Max Friedrich Müller inherited the conviction that you really have to teach with the objects. So he had the library acquire books from across Europe to and allow students to work with the actual objects rather than just the scholarly editions of the 19th century. And you see a history of the book project here in a ring binder left to it, and they would be actually stored together with a actual manuscript in the bookshelves of the Taylorian. So that was the start. And when I took over, that was in 2015, 2 years before the quincentenary of the German Reformation. And I was introduced to the wealth of Reformation pamphlets that the Taylor Institution has, and thought that would be the ideal topic for the history of the book students actually to explore for the next 2 years, try to track the course of the Reformation through its publications. So the first cohort of students experimented with doing some of these digital editions, and we've always tried to combine it with live elements. So we recorded right from the start the text that we were doing. And with this, I'm handing over to Emma Huber, who is talking us through how these editions actually work.
Hello, has my screen on?
Wonderful. Yep. So you can see here.
One of the first editions that we created was the Send Brief from Dolmetschen, which was a key text in Oxford for decades. In fact, it's been on the lecture list, reading list since 1917. It's also been turned into a facsimile before. So this here is a facsimile that was made in 1983 for a Luther anniversary in print and had a good circulation. This is our original copy that the facsimile was taken from. And here we have our latest, our print version that we've produced from the digital edition that we created. So the digital can become print, it doesn't have to just be the other way around. Okay, so where did it actually start from? So we started doing these digital editions, as Henrike says, shortly after she started, so in 2016. At the time, though, we didn't have a platform for it, and I think Henrike can share that view for me.
Yeah, in a second.
Brilliant. So this was the blog that we published them on originally. It's perfectly respectable. You know, it's got all the content on there. It's got the digital edition. I mean, it's got the facsimile. It's got the text. So it's and you could download the original files. But it wasn't ideal. So what came out of those very early editions were several things, really. One was that the students were extremely enthusiastic about this kind of work, really enjoyed engaging with the text and got a lot out of it. Another was that we would be nice to have a proper platform that could do the texts justice. And also from a personal point of view as an academic liaison librarian, it was brilliant to work with students and academics in this way. It brought about lots of connections that were helpful for other aspects of librarianship, book buying, for example, just about everything to do with the job. Having this joint project was extremely useful. And also I was able to sneak in lots of information skills training that I'm sure they wouldn't have come along to an information skills training course. So it's extremely useful from a librarian point of view as well. So I worked on a training course, delivered a training course with help of colleagues to make sure it was up to date in all areas of preservation, imaging and so on, and was able to develop a platform for it, which is the Taylor Editions platform. It was very popular. It quickly expanded beyond modern languages just by word of mouth. Students have enjoyed doing this kind of project. And now it's got about 60 texts. It says 74 results, but some of those are translations. So it's about 60 original texts in a range of different languages. And going back to the Sen brief, where we've had all these different editions, this is the version of the Sen brief on Taylor editions. So you can see it's got the facsimile, which you can zoom into. It's got a transcription, a translation with editorial notes, and it's got access to all these extra information. So you can purchase the print book online. There's a podcast of the relay reading of the original German that was part of the launch event. You can link out to lots of different things. And you can also, if you're not interested in a window, you can close and resize them in the way that you want for your particular task. Plus, of course, all the data is deposited in our repository, Aura Data, our institutional repository, so it can be reused for other projects and give you a sneak preview of the Send brief on a brand new project that's using the semantic web, and that is a visualization of the book history of the Send brief. So I will leave you with that and hand over to Andrew Dunning.
So Andrew Dunning is curator at the Bodleian Library and has been our eyes and arms for the last term to be able to show and zoom into books. Andrew, you have to unmute yourself.
There you go. So this is the Bodleian Center for Digital Scholarship, and this is the setup we've had for actually showing manuscripts to students last term when we haven't been able to have people here in person. This is actually a really simple setup. There's been a number of instructors have focused on using our images from the digital Bodleian website or from other manuscripts websites, and that's that's been quite interesting from the perspective of helping students to actually understand the limitations of what is possible with digitized manuscripts. So, for example, a number of instructors have remarked to me that students have ended up focusing more on textual problems, for example, than material ones. But we've also experimented with actually keeping these as 3D objects by showing them under the camera. So we actually have two options for showing our books. One is using this little device. This is a visualizer. This is not expensive equipment, by the way. You just have to do a bit of research and figure out what one actually needs. So it's a very minimal solution. So we have this visualizer, which is really just all it is basically a USB webcam, which is attached to a stick. It can go up and down. We had our colleagues. The problem with this thing is it's not very big, and so it doesn't really show an entire book very well. And so our colleagues built this nice little wooden box for it so that it won't fall over onto our multiple 10,000-pound manuscripts, and it's very sturdy, and it has a nice little lip here, and then we can also, it gives it enough of a focal range that we can show it this way. Now, some books are more complicated than that, and so the other option that's really that's even more straightforward in some ways than buying one of these things is to actually just have a tripod. All this is a very flexible tripod that we purchased this for about 150 pounds. And you can see that the key feature of this is that it has an arm that swivels all the way up, or in fact all the way down. The one key thing about this is to make sure that you have the arm when it's horizontal. You just need to make sure that you have it lined up with, if you're ever doing this at home, make sure that you have it lined up with one of the legs, so that if someone pushes on this arm, it won't go tipping onto your very expensive book. And then along with that, you can get a little adapter. You can get these online for, for 15 pounds, and that fits into a standard slot for this design for a camera, and so you can put your smartphone onto this mount. And so that way, so again, all we have here is about, we only have a couple £100 worth of equipment, but using that, we can basically show our items as a live video feed using pretty much any platform that we want. And we've been very happy with it, and we'd be very interested in hearing more ideas about what we might be able to do with this in the future.
Henrike, you're muted.
Thanks. We are now going over to Merton's Beast. So, Seb, over to you.
Yeah, cool. So, hello everyone, and thank you for coming. So this is manuscript 249 of the collection in Merton College Library, donated to the college in 1374, but most likely a fair bit older, perhaps dating back to the 13th century. Alongside a number of other long texts, particularly regarding the creation of sermons, the manuscript is perhaps best known because it contains one of only 3 surviving copies of Philippe de Ton's Bestiary. The text draws on a number of earlier Latin texts, such as the Physiologus and the work of Isidore of Seville, but it's the oldest known bestiary to be written in French. The text is a largely moralizing one, presenting various animals and their behaviours before going on to explain their symbolic importance, often explaining how those behaviours mimic important moments in scripture. The text presents itself as consisting of 3 sections, one containing beasts, the second birds, and a third which is a lapidary, explaining the symbolism of certain stones. Perhaps since the commissioners of this copy may have thought that animals were a bit more exciting than stones, and I can't say I blame them, the lapidary section of the text was not copied in its entirety. So in this copy, we have only the 4 sections on the birds and the beasts. So of the 3 surviving copies of the text, Merton's appears to be the latest version, despite not being contained in the youngest manuscript. The text is dedicated to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the wife of Henry II, and so the text in this form can only have appeared after 1154, the year of his coronation. The other 2 copies, meanwhile, which is a 12th century codex in the British Library and another in the Royal Danish Library, which dates from the 14th century, they're instead dedicated to Adelisa of Louvain, the second wife of Henry I, and thus they're potentially copies of an older version of the text, which was originally written as early as 1121. So while Merton's copy is interesting because it shows the kind of enduring fluidity of the text into the later decades of the 12th century and beyond, it's also interesting in its unique mise-en-page. The other 2 witnesses that we can see either side here are or would have been a lot more ornate. So the Copenhagen copy, for example, on the left, contains illuminations in a broad range of colours, while the London copy on the right-hand side has detailed preliminary sketches, which were presumably the beginning of an illumination process that was never completed. Both manuscripts, as you can see, are physically smaller than the Merton copy, and the text block consists of a single column as opposed to Merton's 2. They also make less sparing use of the available space, presenting the text as verse, while the scribes of the Merton manuscripts combined multiple lines of verse into individual written lines. This composition, as well as the functional rather than decorative nature of the illustrations in Merton 249, suggests it was intended primarily for scholarly study rather than as a luxury item, something which is reinforced by its early appearance in the Merton collection. So we're going to turn now to the manuscript, and Merton's fellow librarian, Julia Walworth, is very kindly going to show us some of the manuscript's interesting features. So hopefully. Aha. Fantastic.
So can people see the manuscript?
Perfect.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Julia.
Okay.
So we're starting here with folio 1 verso, with the very first depiction of an animal in the manuscript. So there on the left-hand side, a lion hunting a zebra. Here we also see the only major piece of rubrication in the text, despite a number of Latin descriptions of illuminations elsewhere in the text that would have qualified for rubrication. Here the separation of the rubric by the lion's tail right at the top there suggests that the illustration was completed after the main text in black ink, but before the rubrication in red, pointing to a degree of cooperation between the scribe and the illuminator at this point in the text, or even suggesting that they could have been the same person. Next, we're going to turn to folio 4 recto, but in passing, if we can look at the bottom of folio 3 recto, which is where the dragons are. Here we go. So underneath there, that selection of, we've got unicorns, dragons, and a panther there as well. We can see a blue JR down at the bottom, most likely the initials of the illuminator, or perhaps one of the illuminators, suggesting that by this point in the text, at least, the person who produced the decorated initials was different to the scribe. So folio 4 recto then is interesting. Great, yes. So folio 4 recto shows a lot less cooperation between the scribe and the illuminator to what we saw on 1 verso. So while the lion and the zebra that we saw were neatly slotted into the text and appeared to be drawn in the same ink as the text itself, here the horns of the stag on the top right, which is eating a snake, have run over into the text, making it relatively difficult to read at that point. This seems unlikely to have been a conscious choice, and it's perhaps more likely that the illuminator just ran out of space, having not been left enough room by the scribe. In this case too, the stag appears to have been drawn with a different ink to the main text, since it's faded to be slightly browner in colour than the surrounding text. Folio 4 verso is fun, and I know that's Julia's favourite illumination as well, which shows an army of ants on the left marching across the page. Again, there doesn't seem to have been much cooperation between scribe and illuminator on this one, since the drawings are just kind of slotted in between the text where possible. At the top of folio 5 verso, so over the page there. Great. So right at the top, on the left-hand side, we see an honour centaur who's been very sadly decapitated, most likely by an overzealous 17th century rebinder. This is particularly interesting for me in that it reveals that what's been considered valuable about the manuscript has changed over time. For the original scribe, the text and accompanying images were likely of equal importance, since each complements the other in terms of the moral lessons contained within the text. But by the 17th century, it was perhaps only the text that was considered worthwhile, maybe since the drawings were considered primitive in comparison to those being published at the time, such as in Robert Hooke's Micrographia. Perhaps my favourite illumination in the manuscript is the one on the bottom of folio 8 recto, if we can have a look at that. Great. So in the middle at the bottom there, which depicts a cetus, a whale-like creature of mythology, which is here picked up unsuspecting sailors as they pass by in their ship. The drawing continues the assumption made by artists since classical times and seen in certain examples well into the medieval period that marine animals like whales and dolphins had scales, and also contains the use of red ink, which is the only colour other than black to be used in the illuminations. And you can see that just to the left of the sitters with the frame around the monkeys as well. On folio 10 recto, then, great. So here there's a couple of interesting features. So right up at the top left of the right-hand page, there's a bird there. Hopefully you can see it. Maybe Julie can point it out. Fantastic. Which has again been kind of sadly decapitated by our rebinder. But I suspect it represents a turtle dove, given the surrounding text, although we can't know for certain, since all of the smaller birds are largely represented in the same way. To move over to the right-hand column, and hopefully we'll be able to see this, there's a particularly grand decorated initial I up on the right there. And this one is interesting in that it gets used twice by different lines of the text. So 6 lines down from the top, there's a capital B, which you may just be able to see. And then there's another one just 2 lines below as well. And both rely on the initial to make sense. So they both give the words ibex in Latin in the first instance, and then in Anglo-Norman, which is the ibis that's represented in the bottom right of this folio. Again, looking down there, this bottom margin has been trimmed just as at the top. But these 2 illustrations are interesting in their use of the frames drawn around them, as well as the legend on the left-hand image of the hoopoe there, which explains what the image represents. The majority of the frames and all of the legends in the manuscript are around depictions of birds, so suggesting perhaps that the artist for this section was different to those of earlier folios. This would make sense since, as we've said, the text itself draws a clear separation between the sections containing beasts and those containing birds, and so perhaps this was thought to be a good moment to shift artist. Finally then, if we turn to the bottom of the final page of the text, which is folio 10 verso, wonderful. And down there on the bottom left-hand side, there's a nyctocorax, a nocturnal bird potentially modelled on an owl, which is interesting in what it can tell us about the creation of the illustrations at this end of the text. So around the wings, potentially you might be able to see very faint sketch marks, showing that the drawing was laid out in draft before it was drawn using ink. To the left of the clearer legend too, there's another identical one, perhaps originally written in a red ink, which has faded over time as well. I can't say for certain why there were originally 2 identical labels for this image, but the one that's fared best appears to be in the same ink as the drawing itself, rather than that of the text. So perhaps the left-hand label was originally only intended to be temporary, to remind the illuminator of what to draw in that particular margin, maybe. So there'll be the opportunity to look at the manuscript again later, I promise. But for now, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the project that I've been working on with the text. So if I return to my PowerPoint here. Great, there was that. And let's move on. Awesome. Okay, so my work on this manuscript so far has primarily been to produce a diplomatic transcription and critical edition of Merton's copy of the text in XML with image alongside text, something which has not yet been done, despite a number of critical editions combining the copies of the text across all 3 manuscripts. Using the capabilities of XML, I've been able to mark references to animals, individuals, other works, including scripture, languages and places which are referenced within the text, allowing readers to seek out the parts of the text which are of interest to them. The completed digital edition is now live on the Taylor Editions website, very excitingly. As part of my research, I've also wanted to complete a proof of concept quantitative analysis of the text, which is something that's only possible with a digital edition, to interrogate hypotheses about scribal practice in particular. So what I discovered was rather striking and suggests that while, as you'd expect, there are the hands of numerous scribes within the copy of the text in Merton 249, there are two distinct sections of scribal practice. Since the way that the text is written changes dramatically after the end of the first word of folio to verso, which we'll see in a second. So through my analysis, I found that kind of before this point, in what I call section A, the most common abbreviations by scribes of words and character sequences across the text as a whole were significantly less frequent than in section B, or in some cases even non-existent. So for example, in the case of est, which is never abbreviated in section A, but is abbreviated in just over 40% of the time in section B, and we can see some examples of that here. There we go. A similar distinction revealed itself in the use of punctuation, since the punctus elevatus shown here, which looks quite a lot like an inverted semicolon, is far more frequent in section A than section B. And the continuation marker at the end of lines of type, so used to show that a word is unfinished and runs over to the next line, displays the opposite tendency. So they're very common in section B, but almost non-existent in section A. So the reason I've been able to pinpoint the exact moment at which the shift in scribal practice occurs is due to qualitative indicators that we can see in the first line of folio 2 itself. So here I've blown up the line, and we can see, for example, that there are two distinct D forms being used that I've circled there, one of which is straighter on the left and the other on the right, which is more rounded. The first form is found without exception throughout section A, while the second is found throughout the main text of section B, meaning that the shift in scribal practice must have taken place at this point in the text. What this tells us is that despite there being a scribe or scribes writing section A who had very different practices to those of section B, the two groups were working together. Since they both worked on the same leaf, so the one containing folios 2 recto and 2 verso, indeed even on the same line. As a result, while we might be tempted to assume that the change in scribal practice represents the work of two different scriptoria, the level of cooperation between the scribes of both practices probably means this is unlikely. So I plan to continue this analysis to attempt to determine the exact number of hands in the text and in what way they appear to have shared the burden of copying the text. So that's it from me. I'm open to any questions that anyone might have, or if anyone wants to see anything particular within the manuscript, we can show that as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Seb, for that.